Hi, welcome to our class on international trade. Now, this connects to our farm management and price analysis in several ways. One of the ways is that we're trying to determine what price is in the market. So, kind of understanding a little bit about international trade might give us some insight when we hear news and results in the market. So, let's take a look at this concept called international trade. All right, so what I've done here is done a little homework for us just to get us started and make it easy on what international trade and policy might look like when we talk about price. Well, the first way to start is, of course, probably not, relevant to reality, but it'd be utopia. This concept of free trade, meaning that an exporter, so a domestic market, but an exporter, we might think of this as the United States, especially when we think about things like food production. So as a producer of food products, the United States is a leader. Now, international markets are where we get rid of excess product, and that kind of makes us internationally trade dependent. So as an exporter, we create product, and first let's talk about this market. What makes us an exporter? Well, typically you look at exporters that have high supply, and the other part is you look at exporting countries are those that have an inelastic demand for the product. So this is a great example of the U.S. Inelastic demand is a demand curve that's straight up and down. Very little impact between price and quantity. So if you had something that caused price to go down, that would have a quantity increase, but not very much. If you have a situation where you can get price to go up, then you also have less quantity, but not very much less. Now let's take a different look at another demand curve. Let me slide it up. If you get a demand curve slope like this, now we have a lot of impact between price and quantity. So if anything in the domestic demand market is changing price, you see a huge swing in supply quantity. This is called an elastic type of demand. And in the U.S., we do not have this when it comes to food. We have more what we would call an inelastic demand, very straight up and down. Now, value-added products like branded beef, hormone verified, source verified, grown certain ways, processed in certain ways, all of those things create a situation where you have typically higher prices and typically more elastic demand. You have to keep those value attributes up or you'll lose customers. So I am giving you an example that is very commodity driven. So this is just carcasses of grade, select grade beef. This is carcasses of swine product. This is just number 2 yellow corn. This is just product that we trade with. Typically, those are the items that are traded internationally. Not that value-added products aren't traded, but to set up our situation for free trade, what does an exporter look like? Typically high supply, so way away from the origins of the market, pushed further to the right. Demand, typically inelastic, kind of straight up and down. This creates a situation of what we call low price. So that is typically what most exporter markets need, is to have kind of a low price situation. Now, this excess supply, we can produce way up here. The trouble is we're not, because consumers don't want it for whatever reason based on the demand curve. So we have this area that is a consumer surplus. They're not having to pay it. Producers are losing it. So that comes over and creates what we call international potential supply. Now, let's jump over and look at demand, because international demand is the next. And so we're in the international market, and that's going to be coming from whoever the importer is. Now, what's their market look like? Well, typically they have the opposite of what we talked about before. They have usually high demand and very elastic demand. Usually also low supply or very little supply. So as you start bringing this supply curve up, you see what happens. Price gets higher and higher on them. And so this is typically the setup for what we call an international importer. All right. So that kind of creates our situation, because if you run this dot over there, consumers are sure willing to buy product for that price or less. And that's where the market demand comes from, an international place. All right, so this is the idea of basic free trade or international trade. If markets work well, this would just work all the time. So anything locally, domestically that changes, you're going to end up with a change in the international supply curve, and demand would come from the importer, and these interactions just keep cycling through. Now, there are domestic policies and international policies of the exporting markets that would play a role in this. If we look at something like the European Union, if they are an importer of product, they put restrictions on the products that can be produced, and then the international or the export market can't get into that market because of domestic policy. Also, exporter policies may also be the same. We could do things where supply is pulled back because we want to reduce production, and so you can see that raises the price domestically, and that's going to definitely impact by reducing the amount of supply in the market for trade. And then so you can see how these things interact. And so there's a lot of interactions here that would go on, and it can get complicated to look at, but I thought it was very valuable to talk about this concept of domestic markets, importing markets, and then this international market that results. Because here's what happens. Overall, if these markets interact with the given information, you get something called a world price. And that world price is cheaper for the importers and way more for the exporters. And that's what we're concerned about. So you can see that the price actually goes way up. Now, when we talk about price in the market here, we think about producer and consumer surplus. So consumer surplus is trying to get a low price. We're not worried so much about them in this case. Producer surplus was way down here, and now producer surplus has grown to this area up here above the market equilibrium. So you could say that international trade from a producer standpoint provides us a lot of surplus. Now, lots of situations create barriers in this international market because of what importers do or what exporters do, either one. So I went down here and decided I would just kind of try to plot out what happens when the exporter places a tariff out there in the market. Well, what a tariff's going to do is going to say we have the same domestic production that we've always had. We've had the same domestic supply or demand that we always had. So we have the same equilibrium. So normally we would send this much product over there, and that is still the case. However, as an exporter, we've placed a tariff on these products. So this importer has to pay an additional cost. Well, if we go ahead and say, well, this is the world price, and if we're placing this tariff, it's a tax, we're basically raising that price. That is going to have a huge reduction in what the international market will see, that they will demand, because you're going to have a huge decrease in demand in this importing market. That's going to create a new equilibrium that then creates a new international demand. That new international demand that's lower creates a new equilibrium, and so now internationally you have a drop in the world price in the exporting market. In the importing market, you actually have this quantity. You have an increase in price in the importing market, and so their demand dropped because of this additional tax and the fact that they're going to pay more money. So internationally, they end up with a higher price that they see, but domestically, we end up with a lower price. All right, so these ideas of international trade are a great thing to kind of consider and try to wrap our head around. There's additional resources in the week, so take a look at that video. These videos are all about trying to look at what's been happening out there internationally and how might that affect the prices domestically that we see in the futures market or in local markets, because in this case as a tariff you can see that there's going to be downward pressure. Now the question is how much downward pressure? The question is when? The questions are what other factors control this? This is just one view of it. The value of the dollar, the U.S. value of the dollar could affect this. You could have a tariff with additional policy changes in monetary policy that create no impact from the tariff because of money, the value of the U.S. dollar, I should say. So there's lots of things that impact this, but just as far as the core concepts of trade, these 3-panel diagrams kind of help us see what the impact would be. Again, other factors create it, but as a trader, as somebody trying to manage price of a business, trying to understand these impacts could be important as you see markets change. Thanks.